What is going on, gunfighters? Aspiring gunfighters, boys and girls of all ages. Today's going to be an educational episode, hopefully, on different trigger types, mostly applicable to handguns. Double action, single action, double single action, double action only, single action only, striker fire. What does that even mean? So that's what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life. We're going to break it down Barney style. This was a request, and I forget sometimes to break it down to the basics. You're never too good to bring it back down to the basics. You know, none of us popped out of our mama's womb pulling triggers, myself included. I had to learn it along the way. And I'm blessed to be able to serve you guys today and hopefully explain this different trigger types in a way that you can understand and comprehend, and hopefully explain which one is better for you. With that, as to why you should listen to anything I have to say, I'm going to throw in a quick version of the bio, and then we'll get into the main topic. If, while you're listening or scrolling down to fast forward, if you could hit a like, subscribe, maybe even write a review, hit some stars, that would be very appreciated. Thanks. Blessed to have served in the military, law enforcement, combat veteran, private contractor, competition shooter, lifelong hunter, guide. Blessed by God that He got me through all those things so I could share this firsthand training, knowledge, experience with you to serve you today. Let's dive into the podcast. All right, let's break this down. Single action. The trigger performs one action. The trigger releases the hammer. The trigger drops the hammer. One action. On a single action only, if the hammer is down, you could pull the trigger all day long until you are blue in the face, until you broke the trigger, until you broke the gun. If you could even do that, the gun would not go off if the trigger is down, because that gun can only fire with the trigger back, and the trigger does not cock the hammer. It only drops the hammer. It does one action. It is a single action only gun. What's the benefit of that? It's the best trigger. Unless you do something really atrocious to mess that trigger up, you could get a really bad single action trigger. But in the vast majority of cases, single action triggers are better, period. Since they only have to perform one action, they usually have less pre-travel, less grittiness and creep and grime. They have a less overall amount of travel, and they have less post-travel. They're a cleaner, more superb, more beautiful trigger. They are a more elegant trigger from a more civilized age. They are a fantastic trigger. They are the best trigger as a category. You might find one other trigger that has a better trigger than the worst single action trigger, but that's a generality. Be like if I said men are better at playing basketball than women. Did I just say that in 2022? Yeah, I did. Men are better at playing basketball than women. Now, you could definitely find a female WNBA player that could beat me in basketball. But in general, if you look at the top, or just if you picked 100 people off the street, the men are going to be better at playing basketball than women. In general, single action has the best trigger, bar none. Nothing competes with it unless you just go to the ridiculous. It is the best trigger system as far as you shooting the gun well. It's the best. So why doesn't every gun have a single action trigger? Well, cost is a big one. Generally, they cost more. Also, it's generally considered unsafe to have a single action only gun, meaning the gun will only fire in single action. That trigger will only ever perform one function. It's the general tactical consensus that it is unsafe to carry a single action gun without a manipulated safety, generally a thumb safety, maybe multiple safeties, but it's generally considered unsafe to carry a gun with a single action only trigger without a manual safety. And some people are like, oh, manual safety, it'll get you killed in the streets. You may as well shoot yourself in the knee on your way to the gunfight because the manual safety is just going to get you killed. They'll say, "Oh, it's a fine motor skill. You can't do it in a gunfight." To which I would reply, "Pulling the trigger is a fine motor skill, so just don't go to the gunfight, I guess." But that is the big rub there. It's generally considered unsafe or unacceptable to carry a single action gun without a manipulatable. I'm not talking about internal safeties like a Glock is supposed to have internal safeties. I'm talking about what I'm going to call an active safety that you have to actually think about cognitively until it's muscle memory, process, and disengage before you pull the trigger. And a lot of people are like, "I don't want to do that. That's too much work to tap my thumb down." Don't be ridiculous. Why would I do that when I could just grab a Glock? But that is the real rub there, is that they are the best trigger as the category goes. It's generally considered unsafe to carry them because they have such a light, crisp, delicious, beautiful trigger. So they put a manual safety on there. And some people are like, "Oh, manual safety, I'm out. I will, drive a several thousand-pound vehicle 60 to 80 miles an hour down a freeway, while checking messages on my phone, but don't expect me to hit a thumb safety and pull a trigger. Like, too much work. Don't want to do that." So a lot of people will write off the single action only for that reason. Also, they're more expensive. And we'll get into the cheapest option later, but they're just, in general, by far more expensive than other options. So people like that single action trigger. I think, how can we do this without having to deal with a manual safety that has to be disengaged before we shoot? Even if the gun has a manual safety, what's a safe way to carry it, even if it does or doesn't have a manual safety, where we don't have to disengage it before we shoot, and we still get that good single action trigger? Well, let's just make the first trigger pull double action. Double action, as I alluded to the single action, it just does one action, drops the hammer. The double action cocks the hammer and releases the hammer. Two, or double. It's a double action. It cocks the hammer and releases the hammer. That is a double action. It's a double action. So you could carry the gun. It's got a much longer trigger pull, a much heavier trigger pull to pull the trigger. But after the first trigger pull, we're talking about a semi-auto here, right? Not a revolver. We'll probably talk about those later. But for a semi-auto, your first shot is going to be double action, and then every shot after that, the slide reciprocates, meaning the slide goes back, and the slide itself cocks the hammer. So every subsequent shot, as long as the gun functions as it should, is a single action. So you get a double action and then single action trigger pull. So your first pull is going to be double action, and your consecutive trigger pulls should be single action. This was really in vogue for a long time, especially like in the 80s, 90s, the Beretta 92, double single. The SIG 226, traditionally double single. In my opinion, some of the best combat fighting handguns ever made by humans, period. And they're not the only ones. They're just a couple of the big ones. But for a long time, that was considered like the tactical best of both worlds. You can carry the gun. If you got to skin that smoke wagon and go to work, you can just grab it and pull the trigger. Granted, the first trigger pull is going to be pretty atrocious, but you can do it. And you don't have to worry about the manual safety. You can, even if the gun has a manual safety, generally considered safe to carry it with a round in the chamber without the safety on, because that trigger is so long and heavy. It's got, in general, a very long, very heavy, very linear trigger. It still could be a good, like, smooth trigger, but it's going to be long, linear, heavy, stacking trigger in general, meaning it's going to start fairly light, heavy break. That's generally a quintessential double action trigger. And then again, your subsequent shots are going to be single action. The hammer's already back, so the trigger does not have to cock the hammer. It can just release the hammer. And that's your double single action. Again, your Berettas, your SIG 226s, 229s, many of your early generation Smith & Wesson semi-autos, double single action. I think maybe the first, probably not the first one. There's probably something that preceded it, but the first common one in tactical use, gunfighter use, I think was the Walther P38. Let's just say for the sake of argument, it was one of the Walthers. Maybe the P38. I'm not a gun historian, guys. If you want that, no affiliation with this channel. I don't think he knows that this podcast exists, but Ian Forgotten Weapons, he does a lot of the deep historical dive stuff if you want to get into that. I started serious competitive shooting in the 90s. Anyway, like the 80s, 90s is when double single actions really hit their stride. And I know that... Well, actually, let's do a brief aside. Some police departments decided, you know what, we don't even want to... Maybe it went down this way. I wasn't there. I wasn't in the room as a fly on the wall. But we don't even trust that we should give them double single actions. Let's neuter the gun even more and make double action only. The DAC. Yeah, the SIG HK. They have a lot of conversions where the double single action guns will be double action only. And just know, unless you just find one dirt cheap or something and you want it as like a throwaway gun or a trunk gun or something, they'll still work, they'll still function. Or if you want to be like training for like bench press with a handgun and you just want to lift heavy so that when you have lighter reps it just feels better. You just want a really, really heavy trigger, and you actually want to shoot a decent trigger, and you just want to train with a heavier trigger. Because if you can shoot really good with a double action trigger, in general you can shoot really good with any trigger. So if you want to do that and just have a gun to make it harder for you to train and shoot, then a double action only is good. But the double action only is what it sounds like. It's double action all the time. There is no single action function. It won't allow you to cock the hammer. Every time you pull the trigger cocks and releases the hammer. And the triggers can be pretty smooth and linear, but they're going to be long and they're going to be heavy. Now, that's double action only. DAO. The acronyms you'll see for these, just so you know. SAO, single action only. DASA, double action, single action. And DAO, double action only. Now, this, again, was not the first. I think HK or there was... Striker-fired handguns have been around a long, long time, but the first common, common modern, like I'm talking not like, we're just trying to figure out the semi-auto handgun thing out. I'm talking about modern, common striker-fired handgun was Glock. I know it wasn't the first, it wasn't the second, it probably might even not have been the 10th, but it was the first real common mass-production military police handgun that I'm aware of, aside from some really old World War I, World War II thing, that was striker fired. Getting to the cost. What's the big advantage of striker fire? I'm going to tell you right now, it's cost. It's a simple system. Instead of a hammer and a firing pin where the hammer you have to have an entire apparatus somewhere in the grip or somewhere to have a hammer, to have tension on the hammer, to cock the hammer, hold the hammer, release the hammer, and rinse and repeat. For a striker fire, you basically have a firing pin, which you have to have on any of the other guns anyway, and you have a spring wrapped around the firing pin. The spring gets held back, there is a sear that holds it there, and when you pull the trigger, it lets the firing pin go forward. That's a striker fire. It's a striker. It's a simpler system. It's cheaper. I am going to go out on a limb and say the vast majority of the reason why those are so common and have been for a long time is not because they're good, it's because they're cheap. They're cheap. They're cheap to make, they're cheap to produce. That's why the vast majority of handguns are striker fire. They're cheap. They just are. They're also simple. They're simple, which leads to them being cheap, which also has the advantage of simplicity in general. If you have two identical quality control, like all the components are made to the same standard. If you have less components, you probably have less potential for that machine to go wrong. Because let's say one system has 20 parts, and I'm just throwing out numbers. I don't know what the moving parts on a Glock are. Let's say one system has 20 moving parts, and they're all made to a 9 out of 10 on quality control. And you have another system that has 47 parts, and they're all made to a 9 out of 10 on quality control. You're probably going to have less issues with the simpler design. And to be fair, that is one of the big examples of really well-made striker-fired handguns. They are simple. Now, some of the most reliable handguns on the planet, I think, are hammer-fired guns, like the SIG 226. I don't think anybody's going to argue that the SIG 226 is a legendarily reliable handgun. But Glocks are as reliable, and they're way cheaper. It's a cheaper way. It's a simpler way. They're cheap. Their triggers, although not as heavy, are really bad on most of the early striker-fired handguns. Glock being one of them. I often equate, a Glock trigger, especially if you're like a trigger aficionado, a professional gunfighter, a sommelier of gunfighting, of triggers, then it is like dragging a piano down a gravel road. It just gritty, grimy, atrocious. It kind of makes you cringe and then it breaks. That's a Glock trigger to me. Whereas a good single action, like a really good 1911, is like a fine glass rod that you just apply some pressure to and it snaps. Beautiful. Buttery smooth and then a crisp break. Many of the earlier, cheaper striker-fired triggers are like dragging a piano down a dirt road until it breaks, or like chewing on gravel. That's the analogy I would give to a striker-fired handgun. Now, striker-fired handgun triggers have gotten pretty good, and you shouldn't really equate double single to striker-fire because it's a completely different system. But my best analogy is it's like a 1.5. It's like a 1.5 action. There are exceptions, but most striker-fired handguns, like a Glock classic, when the slide is manipulated, the striker is partially cocked. It's partially cocked by the manipulation of the slide. If you pull the trigger, let's say you have a dead round on a Glock. You pull the trigger on the Glock, you pull the trigger again, it won't fire again. If that round was going to go off the second time, and it won't fire because the action of the slide is what cocks that striker a big chunk of the way. And I don't know if it's 80% or 70% or 60% or 50%, but let's call it it's not a 1 and it's not a 2. It's like a 1.5. Right? It could be a 1.3. I don't know the math. I'm not an engineer for Glock or any of the other Smith & Wesson MMP. But a big chunk of that striker, because remember it's a spring coiled around a firing pin, basically a nail, that hits the back of that round. When that slide is pulled back, it puts some of the tension on that spring. The trigger will put some more tension on that spring. So that striker, that coiled spring, will be partially cocked by the manipulation of the slide. And I know this is audio and it'll be hard to follow. But the rest of the tension, the rest of the pulling back of that spring is going to be done by the trigger. So it's like a 1-point-something action if you wanted to use that. But just striker fired is kind of its own thing. So the triggers, in general, are pretty bad. Now they've done a lot because they're so common and so popular. They've gotten lighter and lighter and lighter. However, lighter is not always good. You can have, and this is maybe getting a little bit off topic, but you can have a really light, really bad trigger. And you can have a pretty heavy, really good trigger. Like I have a Colt Combat Elite 1911. It has a beautiful trigger. It is not light. It's not a light trigger. It's probably heavier than several of my striker fire triggers, but it's clean. It is buttery smooth and then a crisp break. So light, I think, because a lot of people buy guns based on what's on paper. So like, ooh, this one has a 5.5 pound trigger, and this one has a 4.5 pound trigger. It must be better. Not necessarily. But they've done a lot to make the triggers lighter. But a lot of the striker fire triggers, if I was describing them, they'd be like dragging a light piano down a dirt road. There are some pretty good ones. Some of the best ones on the market are the SIG 320s, M17 types. The Walther PDP is pretty good, and the HKVP9 is pretty good for a striker fired. They're not as good as a 1911 trigger. They're not even as good as an average 1911 trigger, let alone a really, really good 1911 trigger. So if you're comparing fairly, like if you're comparing a really good striker fire to a really good single action only, it's still, the single action only is still better. It's just better. That said, they're cheaper, they're a giant chunk of the market, and they're readily available. And for whatever reason, it's not considered to carry a single action gun with the safety off safe, but it's totally acceptable to carry the same weight trigger in a striker-fired handgun. Let's say a 1911 has a 5.5 pound trigger and a Glock has a 5.5 pound trigger. For some reason, it's totally acceptable to carry them the same way, one with no external safety. If it's a striker fire, it's okay. But if it's a 1911 or a single action only, it's not okay. I don't understand that, but that's the general tactical consensus. So, it's probably the cheapest, and this is probably why they're so popular. To be honest, I really think so. They're the cheapest, easily trainable. Like if I'm trying to get a cop who is not a gunfighter, right? Most cops are not gunfighters. They're clerks and administrators. It's a hard job. I've been there. I've done that. But most of them are not gunfighters. Ask them how much time they spend pulling a trigger and how much time they spend behind a keyboard or, writing with a pen or any other number of tasks as opposed to actually gun work. It's not even close. So they say, how can we take this guy who's a very tiny fraction of his actual job is using a gun, and how can we get him spun up relatively safely, relatively effectively, so he can generally sling lead downrange and hit a giant silhouette target at a fairly close distance? And the easiest, cheapest, most affordable way to do that for the past almost 20 years probably has been striker fire. With the price that you pay for a Glock as a regular citizen is not the price that police departments, when they buy them in bulk, pay for Glocks. And kind of a genius thing on Glock marketing is if we sell these to cops, people will think the cops know what they're doing, and people will want to buy the guns that cops have, so they'll buy Glocks too. Genius marketing. But anyway, they're the cheapest job. They're the cheapest gun that will get the job done in most cases, and they will. They will, right? So if you want the lowest common denominator, the cheapest option to get the job done, polymer striker-fired handgun is probably for you. There are some other departments and stuff, and when I was a commander of a tactical team, I wrote a pretty liberal policy, liberal meaning pretty lax, as long as they could pass, and our quals were really hard, so that would weed out the bad guns and the not great shooters. I made the qual hard, but I would let them carry basically whatever they wanted. But there were several people that would still pass with a Glock. And I went through initial training with a Glock because I knew it was the most common handgun, even though it was really hard training. It can be done. I would consider it kind of a handicap, but you can do it. Polymer striker-fired handguns. And again, some of those polymer striker-fired triggers have gotten pretty good. So if you're looking to start out, probably just start out with a polymer striker-fired handgun. They're cheap, they're easy, they'll get the job done. And I don't think you'd ever regret having like a good, functional, reliable polymer striker-fired handgun. So that's kind of the difference in the trigger types. So we talked about when you might want a polymer striker fire. One, you're on a budget. Two, and these aren't the only reasons, but we'll go through a couple. One, you're on a budget. Two, your department or your division of competition shooting requires that you carry a striker-fired handgun. You really like to tinker and do your own work on guns, and you want to get into it, and you want cheap parts and cheap options. Remember how I said it's a simpler system? Well, that also makes it a simpler system to work on. Consider it like the small block Chevy. It's just easier to work on than a lot of other systems. So if you're the guy that wants to tinker around and like do this thing and do that thing, they're simpler to understand. They're a simpler system. You have less parts in general that have to. Usually in a lot of those things, there's more segregation in what one part will do. So if you want to mess with a part, it's not going to interact with a bunch of other parts. So if you like to tinker and you like to switch stuff out and swap stuff, probably striker-fired system is probably better. Did we already say if somebody makes you? Like I am right now, I haven't redone a new version of the bio, but I am professionally gunfighting again. I'm a private security contractor, and they require us to carry Glocks. I'll be honest, I almost didn't take the job because I didn't want to carry a Glock to trust my life to it, but I knew that I could get the job done with a Glock. So if you're required to, that's another good reason. So there are some really good reasons to carry a polymer striker fire. What about, and it's easy to train on. They're easy. It's generally accepted that you don't need a manual safety, so many of the polymer striker fireds, you literally just grab the gun and pull the trigger. So it's simplicity. If you're looking for a similar concept to a police officer being like, I'm not a gunfighter, I'm not going to be a gunfighter, I really don't want to spend a lot of time and effort training. I want a simple solution where I can do some training and be able to cover my bases for most situations. I'm not going to strive for excellence. I'm not going to want the best tool for the job. I just want something that's cheap and affordable, that's a low barrier to entry, and minimal training that can get the job done. Polymer striker fire, probably for you. Single action only. Most of those are more complex systems. Your classic one is a 1911. So when is that a good option? When you really want the most exquisite trigger, whether it's a 1911 or some other single action only. When you're like, I want the most exquisite, most delicious trigger on the menu, and I'm willing to put up with more maintenance, more complex system, harder to gunsmith on, and I'm willing to train with the manual safety. You might want to look at a single action only. Double single action. You kind of want the option of a good, crisp single action only trigger, but you also want that double action trigger for your first pull. You don't want it, for whatever reason you're averse to a manual safety. You don't want to run a manual safety, but you also want a better trigger than a striker fire. You might look at the double single action. Double action only, you found one at a pawn shop and it was a really good price and you wanted to train hard and lift heavy. Double action only, in my opinion. Let's talk about revolvers real quick. Some of the first revolvers, and double actions actually go pretty far back, but commonly, like when you think of like the Wild Wild West, the old cowboy movies, those are single action only. You had to manually cock the hammer for every shot. If the hammer wasn't cocked, you could pull that trigger until you died of old age. That gun is never going to go off until you cock the hammer. You can do it pretty quickly, but you have to cock the hammer every time. Most modern revolvers, they'll call them double action, but they're really double single action unless they've been modified otherwise. Most of them you can either just pull the trigger and the hammer will go back and go forward, double action only, or you can cock the hammer and fire single action only. But it's different in that after you pull the trigger the first time on a double single semi-auto, it's going to be single action as long as the gun functions properly. On a modern double action revolver, even though it's not double action only, it is going to be double action every time you pull the trigger unless you cock the hammer. So it's kind of pick your own adventure. You want to fire it double action, you just pull the trigger. You want to fire it single action, you cock the hammer and then pull the trigger. So that'll do both. There are a few revolvers that have been modified so they're double action only. Some police departments, again, might have mandated that. In fact, my J-frame from LAPD, while I was LAPD, had to be double action only. When I got out, I reconverted it back to the normal configuration. But when you see double action on a revolver, that's generally what it means, is that if you just pull the trigger, it will cock the hammer and fire it. If you want to cock the hammer, it will fire single action only. But every pull is going to be double action unless you cock the hammer. Hopefully that makes sense. And there are still plenty of the old single actions out there. People have the nostalgia, or for like a hunting handgun where rate of fire is not that big a deal, single action. Because again, you want that light, crisp trigger every time. So anyway, some thoughts there and some explanations on trigger types. It's actually a good suggestion. I thought it was going to be rather simplistic, but hopefully this helps you understand better and helps you maybe choose what's best for you, not just what somebody else is trying to shove down your throat. What's the next cool hot thing? Decide what actually fits you and your personality and your situation. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hey guys, as I alluded to, this was a Patreon suggestion. Patrons get a lot of really cool insider-only content. They get a lot of episodes that you're just not going to get unless you're a patron or you're just like a master hacker. And if you're a master hacker and you're spending your time hacking into my Patreon, I don't think that's a thing. But if you actually want that content, the insider-only content, just to give you a little taste of upcoming, God willing, this week, and this, I'm recording this, I don't know when it's going to come out, but at the time I'm recording this, what's coming up this week, Square Peg, Patreon-only episode. That's kind of trying to stay in your lane as far as what philosophies and stuff apply as a gunfighter. $600 blasters. Like, what are my best picks for $600 guns? My beef with Springfield. tactical Tupperware. Probably guess what that one's about. Modern rifle philosophy. Those are just some things for the Patreon page that are coming out this week, just to give you a little taste. And there's a lot of stuff on Patreon. When you become a paid member, you can scroll back through. All right, enough about that. Your tactical tip of the day. Natural point of aim. I was working with this today. I am blessed to have a little apprentice, a 12-year-old girl that had never shot before the other day, and I was blessed to be able to let her shoot her first shots, and she really likes it. She kept coming back today when I was like, no, we're done. It's a neighbor's daughter. She kept coming back saying, let's shoot more, and a couple times I didn't. Finally, I was like, no, we're done for the day. But she really likes it. But one of the things I was teaching her today was natural point of aim, whether it's a rifle or a handgun. Get in your position, close your eyes, take a deep breath, relax, open your eyes. Are you still pointed at the target? If yes, your natural point of aim is good. If not, your natural point of aim needs rectifying. So rectify it. And that could be many different things. It could be your elbows. It could be, wiggling your body around. It could be shoulder tension. It could be a bunch of different things, whether it's handgun or a rifle. But natural point of aim, don't forget about it. It's an important part of marksmanship. Your tactical verse of the day. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to think of anything as being from ourselves, but our sufficiency is from God. What a blessed verse that is. Whatever you have, whatever you're able to do, it's not because you're so cool or so awesome or so strong or so smart. It's because God allowed you to. You wouldn't have a single brain cell. You wouldn't be able to take a single breath or have a single heartbeat if it wasn't by God's leave. Meaning He allows it. He blesses you with it. Every heartbeat and every breath is a gift of God. It would be well to remember that and live like that. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.